I'm Dr. James Blackwell, Korean War historian for the 307th Bombardment Group Association. This is the 5th episode in the association's video history of the 307th in the Korean War. The group was redesignated a wing in 1951 and fought in the two major air battles of the Korean War, one in April, the other in October. Part 1 of our story covers the spring and summer months. In the next episode, we'll look at fall and winter. Contrary to what most historians say, this period was not a dark time for the 307th. Of course, it was tragic. From April through December 1951, the 307th lost 16 aircraft. 58 airmen were killed or missing in action, and 34 remain unaccounted for to this day. Yet in the face of this epic struggle, the airmen of the 307th Bombardment Wing gave no counsel to fear. They continued to fight with extraordinary resilience, beyond the limits of ordinary human endurance. For example, radio operator Master Sergeant Walter Scott of Tampa, Florida, completed his 100th combat mission in 1951, half of which he accumulated in World War II over Europe. It's true that losses suffered by B-29 bombers in April and October 1951 led the generals to direct a temporary halt to daylight visual bombing. But that did not make the B-29s less effective. In fact, the new tactics, techniques, and procedures they developed for nighttime and adverse weather bombing proved to be even more powerful for the interdiction campaign and more deadly for the close-in ground battles that brought the communists to armistice talks. More importantly, the new tactics shut down the enemy airfields in North Korea within 3 months, keeping the MiG-15 to a small radius around Antung, China. The corralling of the MiG-15 by the B-29 gave the U.S. Air Force time to bring more F-86 Sabre jets to Korea. These American fighters would reestablish air superiority, and in less than a year, Bomber Command resumed daylight bombing with even more effective tactics, techniques, and procedures. Combat crew attention to detail never let up as radio operator Staff Sergeant Walter Doherty completes his pre-flight check of the safety pins on these 500-pound bombs in a June combat sortie. Such airmen of the 307th immediately rose up from each combat loss, adapted how they fought, and continued to take the fight into the heart of the enemy's airspace, territory, and soul. While ground fighting stabilized along the 38th parallel, U.S. intelligence saw the communists building up for an air offensive. Soviet combat air power in China along the Yalu Sanctuary swelled since the initial air engagements in November 1950, and much of it was committed to training the rapidly expanding Chinese Air Force and its North Korean apprentices. Mao's pilots now had more than 600 MiG-15s of their own, and were quickly gaining proficiency from their Russian flight instructors. Soviet records assert that on April 3rd, a pair of upgraded MiG-15s took off from Andong Airfield on the Chinese side of the Yellow River and flew at high altitude all the way to Seoul. Seoul had just been retaken by the American Army forces, and the Soviets claimed that their MiGs evaded anti-aircraft fire and an intercept attempt by U.S. Sabre jets. These claims remain unsubstantiated. The initial Soviet fighter regiment was pulled off combat alert to train more Chinese and North Korean pilots. Meanwhile, the pride of the Soviet fighter force, the 324th Air Division, deployed from Moscow to take up combat patrol duty over Mig Alley. This outfit was commanded by World War II's top ace, Colonel Ivan Kozyev, credited with 62 combat victories in World War II. More than half of his pilots had World War II combat experience. And Kozyedov's division replaced its MiG-15s with up-engined MiG-15 Beast models, giving them greater speed, climb, and maneuver. U.S. military leaders proposed a maximum effort air campaign to roll back this buildup. President Truman authorized a stepped-up air campaign, but did not remove his prohibition on strikes across the Yalu River into China. Although the 307th still lived in Kadena tent city, morale and motivation were high at the beginning of April 1951. Quonset huts were built to house squadron officers. The personnel section posted rotation schedules through July so everyone could see when they were due to go back to the States. A qualification program made new crews mission ready in a week. Bombardiers and gunners improved their skills through a continuing training regimen each month. Highly effective maintenance kept the wing's aircraft availability rate above 90%. About one combat crew per week went on R&R leave to Japan, and a resort on an Okinawan beach was now open for deserving support airmen on weekends. On the ground, the Chinese fourth phase offensive kicked off on April 21st. By May, it reached its culminating point. The People's Volunteer Army by this time had been badly mauled. Its soldiers were exhausted from incessant combat. Their supply lines had been constantly bombed for months, further weakening their fighting capabilities. In April, the battle line had already moved north of Seoul to within shouting distance of the 38th parallel. The 307th continued to fight in the aerial interdiction campaign. The principal targets were the bridges on the Korean side of the Yalu River and the supply centers inside Mig Alley, striking those targets on April 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 5th. April 6th, when three ships were on approach back to Kadena from bombing the Sinanju Supply Center, a freak windstorm forced them to divert to Naha Air Base on Okinawa. Aircraft number 45-21725 overshot the runway due to poor traction and visibility, and it came to rest in shallow water in the East China Sea. One crew member was injured, the other 10 were unhurt, but the aircraft was written off as a loss for salvage. Bomber Command also introduced a new technique for tactical air support missions. These nighttime X-ray missions enabled B-29s to strike ground targets with precision at night or in adverse weather using AN/MPQ-2 radar systems. Late in World War II, U.S. airmen using specially designed microwave radar units from MIT Laboratory had the idea of using radar sets not only to detect enemy aircraft, but also to follow U.S. aircraft and guide them to their targets. By plotting on the map the airplane's position indicated by the radar set, ground controllers could use the same calculation devices used by airplane navigators to provide the pilot with corrections to his flight vector over a radio to stay on a course straight to the target. Pilot did not need to see the ground for himself, and using the same bombing devices used by the bombardier, the ground controller could calculate the bombing solution to tell the bombardier precisely when to drop his bombs. It did not take long for ground controllers and airmen to learn how to coordinate in real time on bombing missions. MIT kept sending improved radar, plotting, and calculating machines to the Air Force. The Air Force continued to sharpen the controller skills, and by January 1951, Strategic Air Command had 12 detachments assigned at key bombing ranges used for scoring its B-29 crews on training missions and evaluations. Not long into the Korean War, SAC deployed 3 of its bomb-scoring detachments to the theater of war, with the most advanced tracking, plotting, computing, and communications equipment in truck-mounted mobile vans. They brought their own power generators and needed only security and chow support from ground troops. Each detachment was assigned to one of the 3 U.S. Army Corps engaged in the fight and positioned a few kilometers behind the front lines. Each day, the Corps would select a target for nighttime tactical missions integrated into their ground maneuver and fire support plan. The Corps would provide the coordinates and time on target required. All that an aircrew had to do was obtain a vector to target from the assigned ground controller, which would put a bomber at a spot where the narrow beam MPQ could pick it up. On the ground, the MPQ controller specified the altitude, airspeed, and heading which the crew would fly to a target. At the initial point, the MPQ controller would give orders to open the bomb bay doors and arm bombs. Starting at 10,000 yards from the target, the controller began a countdown to 0, at which point the bombardier released his bombs. In addition to interdiction missions, the 307th flew 2 X-ray missions beginning on the night of April 3rd and again on the 4th, 10th, 24th, 25th, 7th, 28th, and 30th. Not one of these strikes received enemy anti-aircraft fire. Enemy prisoners of war said this was highly effective because their troops would try to come out of their foxholes and trenches at night, but were then vulnerable to bombing. U.S. ground troops' appetite for such close air support was insatiable. Just after the 307th dropped its bombs, 6 MiGs attacked the B-29s as they turned for the departure point. The enemy attack quickly struck one B-29, tail number H6268, Captain Melvin J. Howard, aircraft commander. Captain Howard directed the flight engineer to feather 2 engines. The aircraft lost altitude and fell out of formation. Another B-29 flew cover for the damaged aircraft as it left the target area. The 2 B-29s headed toward the west coast of North Korea with the damaged aircraft on fire and trailing smoke. As 268 reached the coast, the bombardier bailed out of the fatally stricken aircraft. 3 other parachutes opened before the aircraft exploded in midair. Of the 11 men aboard, rescue efforts saved only 1 crew member, the bombardier, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Schallenberger. The remaining 9 crewmen are still unaccounted for. A second 307th B-29 was severely damaged, but it made it back to Kadena. Soviet records credit Captain Ivan Suchkov, who became a jet double ace with this kill, verified by this gun camera photo from Suchkov's MiG-15. No one knew it yet, but the 307th was now up against the best and the boldest of Soviet MiG-15 fighter pilots and commanders. But Suchkov's commander, Colonel Kozyrev, was not at all pleased. His airmen had failed to repel the B-29 attack. He particularly drew attention to the fact that his regimental commanders had directed their pilots' action from the ground and had not personally participated in the battle, obliging them to draw the appropriate conclusions. The 307th was again over North Korea the very next day, 8 April, undaunted by the fighter opposition and losses taken the previous day. 11 aircraft hit at the enemy's supply lines by bombing the railway bridge at Yongmidong, a key railroad choke point across the Changchun River in the southwest part of MiG Alley. The bombs fell on the northwest side of the bridge, but again, no spans were observed to go down. Meanwhile, from his Daiichi Building headquarters in Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur continued to press the limits of the American principle of civilian control over the military. He was even more insistent on extending the war into Manchuria to cut off the lifelines of the Chinese spring offensive. As he later put it, there is no substitute for victory.
At the White House, the administration, represented by the President, is seriously concerned. Mr. Truman speaks to the nation, outlining the reasons for his action regarding world policy.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders.
In the new atomic age, there would be no such thing as victory, as MacArthur conceived of it. On April 11th, Truman replaced General of the Army Douglas MacArthur with General Matthew Ridgway as commander of United Nations forces. Ridgway was a convert to the new dogma of limited war. The air war proceeded apace. BOMCOM's operations order for the 12th of April called for a maximum effort mission of 46 B-29s with 80 fighter escorts for another daylight strike on the Yalu River Railroad Bridge at Sinuiju. It was still standing. Each group, the 19th, 98th, and 307th, was to bomb in a column of flights formed into diamonds to maximize defensive firepower. But the communists' buildup of air power began to take a toll. They positioned MiG-15s just east of the Sinuiju airfield. This reconnaissance photo looks hardly like part of an air base, but the North Koreans had developed sophisticated camouflage measures. Intelligence photo interpreters identified 8 aircraft revetments on this road just off the main runway. Up north, bomber crews could see the heavy black exhaust smoke as MiGs climbed up from the Entong airstrip. A spotter plane called out MiG takeoffs with "A train is leaving the station." Winds aloft of 125 to 150 knots from the initial point to the target caused such excessive drift that the bombers had to cross the Yalu River into protected Manchurian airspace to release their bombs to hit their designated points of impact. Earl McGill asserts the Air Force never admitted that they, in fact, flew over a MiG base.
The main role of the MiG-15 was to intercept American bombers, which were raiding North Korea with their Sabre escorts. The principal MiG tactic was to take advantage of its superior altitude and lie in wait at heights of up to 50,000 feet, and then ambush the American air armadas below.
If possible, go up to 50,000 feet. 50,000 feet, then American plane wouldn't come up there. You go up to 50,000 feet and look down at the American plane and go down and shoot.
307th and its escorts had to fight their way to and from their target through heavy fighter and flak opposition. For approximately 20 minutes, over 30 enemy MiG-15s attacked. The fighter escort for the first 2 flights of B-29s was excellent, but the Russians managed to penetrate the escort for the Charlie flight. The number 4 aircraft, tail number 44-62252 of the 371st Squadron, was under continuous fighter attack by 10 MiGs beginning at 3 minutes before bombs away. Soviet MiG-15 gun cameras were rolling during this attack. Here's one pilot's photo used to claim his credit on April 12th. The trailed B-29 is obviously dragging smoke from its number 1 engine and is probably the 371st's number 252. The B-29 stayed aloft long enough to allow the crew to bail as it flew out to the Yellow Sea. 6 crewmen were rescued that day. The other 6 landed in enemy territory, and their bodies were eventually returned to military custody. Communist flak and fighters hit 2 more 307th B-29s, but neither of these aircraft suffered any casualties. Images are from the gun camera of Captain Serafim Subbotin, credited with 1 B-29 kill on April 12th. Subbotin would go on to post 9 victories in the Korean War by Russian scores. Another 307th B-29 was damaged by fighter action, and a third took hits from moderate and accurate flak in the target area. Neither aircraft suffered casualties. Colonel Kozyedov's fighter pilots scored dozens of hits on the 307th. The Soviets' unit histories claimed to have shot down 11 B-29s and damaged another 14 on April 12th. Perhaps the Russian pilots could not believe their own eyes when they pounded a B-29 with a full combat load of 23mm cannon fire, and it did not go down. The fact of the matter is, the B-29 was a sturdy, resilient aircraft that could take hundreds of hits and keep flying. Here, Technical Sergeant Carl C. McHolland of Louisville, Kentucky, points out structural damage caused by an anti-aircraft projectile passing through a wing section of his B-29. Technical Sergeant Claude Motton of Patton, Kansas, aids his sheet metal men by pointing out impacts. His plane had 73 flak holes, but was repaired at the sheet metal shop in only 23 hours. Nevertheless, B-29 losses overall for the Sinuiju mission were so great, the 307th had lost 1, the 19th lost 5 on April 12th, that Lieutenant General Stratemeyer discontinued B-29 strikes on Sinuiju for some time. Overall, in April 1951, the 307th lost 2 B-29s to hostile fire at the Yellow River, and 17 crewmen were killed or missing in action. But those losses did not go on. Of the 307th's gunners showed extraordinary skill and determination on this mission. Staff Sergeants David R. Stein, left scanner, and Ursel Dye, tail gunner, were each officially credited with the destruction of a MiG-15 in aerial combat near Sinuiju, North Korea on 12 April 1951. B-29 gunnery was far different than it was on the B-17. It was computer controlled. The gunner did not sight down the barrel. Instead, he had an optical sight with an illuminated circle of dots. He had to know the wingspan of the aircraft he was shooting at in order to place the correct dot on the target. As soon as he tracked it for a few seconds, the analog computer calculated the firing solution and mechanically placed the correct lead and elevation to ensure the bullets went where the enemy aircraft was going to be when the bullets got there. The gunner had to keep the correct circle on the target for several seconds.
The 29 used another innovation, the General Electric Remote Gunnery Control System. All guns were sighted and fired remotely.
4 of the turrets, 2 on top and 2 beneath the fuselage, can turn through 360 degrees in azimuth, 90 degrees in elevation. The tail turret is more restricted in movement, but it has a 20-millimeter cannon in addition to the twin 50s the others carry. But the big thing about the 29's armament is the fact that the gunners don't touch the guns. The guns are controlled remotely from special sights, and any gunner can fire almost any turret. For example, one side gunner might have control of 2 turrets, firing 4 caliber 50s at his target.
A small central computer made corrections for wind, temperature, altitude, speed, and extended range by correcting for bullet drop. Gunners using this remote system experienced no jarring recoil and gun vibration, easing the task of holding a target in sight. Gun camera footage of fighters shot down is terrifyingly real. The camera is activated by the firing mechanism.
The challenge for the B-29 gunner was that the MiG-15 was so fast and so maneuverable, a well-trained and experienced enemy pilot could outpace the B-29's guns for the precious few seconds they were visible to the gunners. B-29 gunners who scored MiG kills generally started firing at 1,000 yards range, and for the tail gunner the attacks always came from 6 o'clock, the position of greatest vulnerability in any aerial encounter. In the Soviet version of the April 12th air battle, American fighters and bombers could do nothing to stop the onslaught of overwhelming Soviet air power. They called it Black Thursday for the American B-29s. Their MiG pilots claimed they fought relentlessly until they ran out of ammunition and returned to their bases on empty fuel tanks. These Reds reported that B-29s dropped out of the formations and not a single group of B-29s succeeded in reaching the target. Their reports asserted the superfortresses jettisoned their payloads and turned back. The 324th Air Division credited themselves with 10 downed B-29s and another 5 B-29s as probable kills. In a subsequent corrective history published in 2016, based on research into Soviet military archives, Soviet MiG-15 pilots Subotin, Kramarenko, and Lazutin were credited with only 2 B-29 kills among the 3 of them on this mission. On their side, they claimed only 2 MiGs received any damage beyond a few bullet holes. The Russian record reads, in the subsequent days of April 1951, after Black Thursday, the intensity of combat sharply fell. Although there were just as many combat sorties as before, encounters with the enemy became rare because the enemy avoided them. On April 16th, the wing celebrated its 150th mission of the Korean War at the mess hall with free beer, a first-class steak dinner, and music by one of the many bands at Kadena Base. With base photographers snapping dozens of photos, Wing Commander Colonel Reynolds cut a huge cake. A good time was had by all. Bomber Command strikes proceeded without hesitation, consisting of 12 bombers daily during the period 17 to 23 April on airfields at Pyongyang, Anak, Sariwon, Kangdong, Yangpo, Hamhung, Sinmak, and Sunan. North Koreans tried to be clever in camouflaging their aircraft at those airfields. Here at the Pyongyang airfield, they parked the aircraft on the ground and covered them with brush, without the telltale defensive revetments that would stand out to overhead photo reconnaissance. And the communists replaced all their downed bridges within days and repaired their airfields in hours, using crude methods and impressed labor. After 23 April, B-29 missions turned again to interdiction. Commander Colonel John Reynolds was a familiar presence on the flight line during mission preparation. Here he provides a crew with specific guidance on his intent in their sortie to an interdiction target in May 1951. These 5 crew members were all from Michigan. Tech Sergeant Roy Reed, flight engineer, PFC Gordon Morrow, gunner, Second Lieutenant Howard Brandt, pilot, and Second Lieutenant James Bell, pilot. In May, the last of the original 307th combat crews rotated back to the United States after 9 months of what had begun as a 30-day TDY. Although replacement crews were slow in arriving and confusion over the length of service for reservists who had been recalled to active duty contributed to personnel challenges, morale among the Wing's airmen was excellent. By the end of May, Lieutenant General Van Fleet's ground forces had stopped the Communist spring offensive, inflicting an estimated 200,000 losses on enemy troops. B-29s employing the MPQ-2 contributed thousands of enemy killed to that defeat of the Communist forces. The repeated airstrikes on airfields had stymied the Chinese Air Force and their Russian mentors from establishing air bases in North Korea. BombCom would wait until the Communists had just completed their slave labor reconstruction to strike those airfields again and again and again, and those airfields never became fully operational. The 1951 Spring Ground Offensive would be the last all-out major communist operation for the duration of the war. Their objective to permanently drive the UN out of Korea had failed. The 8th Army launched a counteroffensive in the fall of 1951 that erased all communist gains and returned the UN forces to a frontline trace approximately 2 to 6 miles north of the 38th parallel. But the cost in casualties was high, and the Korean War fell into a situation that has come to be characterized as a stalemate. In fact, neither side would acknowledge military defeat. U.S. intelligence accurately assessed that the Soviets and Chinese were intent on continuing a war of attrition that would cause United Nations participants eventually to yield more favorable terms to their North Korean clients. And they made it clear that they would not consider a negotiation until all United Nations troops were withdrawn from the peninsula and all prisoners returned. But tens of thousands of POWs held by the United Nations yearned for freedom and did not want to be repatriated to the northern slave masters, who would certainly extract severe payback and retribution. In fact, many thousands of North Korean prisoners of war held at South Korea's Kojido Island prison camp were practicing or professing Christians. North Korea was home to a sizable number of followers of Jesus before the communist takeover in 1945, the result of diligent missionary work in the late 19th century that had exploded into rapid indigenous expansion among North Koreans. In fact, the great 1907 Pyongyang revival led to that city become known among the faithful as the Jerusalem of the East. The large Christian population at Kojido led to the assignment of Chaplain Harold Volkel, a former missionary who was fluent in the Korean language. There were some hardcore, troublemaking communists at Kojido, but they were greatly outnumbered by those who yearned for their freedom in the South. Some United Nations members had sent out signals indicating their desire to talk their way out of war, but the North Koreans and Chinese would not budge. Then, in a wholly unexpected moment, on June 23rd, Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Jacob Malik broadcast a speech from the Soviet United Nations offices in New York and said it was now time for talks to set a ceasefire.
further believe that the most acute problem of the present day, the problem of the armed conflict in Korea, could also be settled. This would require the readiness of the parties to enter on the path of a peaceful settlement of the Korea problem. The Soviet people believe that as a first step, discussions should be started between the belligerents for a ceasefire and an armistice, providing for the mutual withdrawal of forces from the 38th parallel. Can such a step be taken? I think it can, provided there is a sincere desire to put an end to the bloody fighting in Korea. I think that surely is not too great a price to pay in order to achieve peace in Korea.
Stalin, it seems, as a first step, wanted his allies to step back from the 38th parallel and find a way other than war to codify their position on the Korean peninsula. China, a few days later, indicated their willingness to talk about such a ceasefire, and their North Korean subservient client had no other option than to go along with their sponsors. Historians, in hindsight, point to a convergence of strategic factors among the U.S. and its United Nations allies, the South Korean government, and the Chinese and North Korean leaders, constrained by their military dependence on the Soviets, all coming together to provide the impetus in this direction. General Ridgway announced a week later that he had been authorized to open armistice talks. A week after that, North Korea's leader Kim Il-sung and China's foreign minister Chou En-lai also publicly agreed. But to back up U.S. firm intent, the bombing campaign continued unabated. The 307th conducted 13 missions in June, including daylight and night interdiction and close support targets. On June 19th, the 307th flew 19 X-ray missions on 16 close air support targets, and on July 28th used the technique to strike 27 ground targets. Ground controllers reported highly effective results. On the 4th of July, the 307th was fully tasked with strikes on 9 daylight targets, airfields and supply centers, and 2 nighttime X-ray missions. The 307th Sergeant Jack Kersey of Tampa, Florida, an armament technician, proudly shows off his work preparing some fireworks to be detonated on North Korea on Independence Day 1951. The 307th celebrated its 200th mission on 17 July. With peace seemingly ready to break out, this event was to be a special one. The celebration began at 1100 with the reading of a proclamation by Wing Commander Colonel John Reynolds to the assembled officers and airmen in the wing area. Accompanied by music supplied by the 20th Air Force Band, the men were then transported to Okinawa's Ishikawa Beach. Sporting tournaments among squadrons in softball, volleyball, and swimming were capped off with a softball game between one team of officers and an airman's team. The more mature officers, of course, were the victors. Colonel Reynolds cut the 200th mission cake, and the men were treated to a celebratory feast served up by the wing's own mess crew in a Kadena Air Base gymnasium, followed by a song fest among all. For their evening entertainment, the organizers had arranged for a 2-hour competitive home talent show of skits from each squadron, capped off with a grand finale ballet featuring airmen in drag with an act called the Dolly Sisters. Each airman went away with a printed booklet designed by Wing Chaplain Hurley, who had been assigned to plan, organize, and supervise preparations for the celebration. North Korean and U.S. liaison officers met first on July 8th, and talks began officially on 11 July in Kaesong, a town that had formerly been capital of unified Korea. Air power advocates claim credit for U.S. Air Forces in reaching this point in the war. The official Air Force historian wrote, "Having no hope for victory, nor prospect except to continue to incur enormous losses of men and materiel, the Communists requested an armistice in June 1951. Air power had been the decisive factor in the outcome of the ground battle. It had caused the collapse of the Communist logistical system and had inflicted tremendous casualties upon the enemy's massed offensives. And indeed, the North Korean senior delegate to the armistice talks, Lieutenant General Nam Il, commented, "I would like to tell you frankly, it is owing to your strategic air effort of indiscriminate bombing of our area that your ground forces are able to maintain, barely and temporarily, their present positions."